Very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers. We're delighted to have you with us. This is Let's Talk. Afternoon to all of our viewers. We're delighted to have you with us. We are grateful for the opportunity to come your way again. We apologize for that little feedback there, but we believe we do have things under control now. So let me say again, welcome and good afternoon. Welcome to Let's Talk. We are sharing this afternoon, continuing our series on religious liberty. And again, we have the same two guests we had last week. We understand that some of you were unable to join us last week. One of our streaming platforms did not cooperate with you. But we are here today and we are grateful. We had an exciting time last week as we discussed the Seventh Adventist Church and religious liberty. Today we are talking about religious liberty and public legislation. With us this afternoon, we have Pastor Stanton Adams. Pastor Stanton Adams, he was with us last week and he's with us again. I'm just going to give him a few seconds to say hello. He is the pastor of the District 1 in St. Kitts. He is a former administrator of the Guyana Conference, has tremendous background work in religious liberty and other matters. We are delighted to have Pastor Adams with us again. Pastor, good afternoon and welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Greene, and good afternoon to all of our viewers and listeners. It's my delight to join you and together this afternoon again to continue this very interesting, intriguing conversation on the matter of religious liberty. I trust that those who are on the live and wherever they're viewing from, will call the others up and let them join, because this is a very important conversation for many reasons.
Certainly. And we have a second guest with us. We have attorney Natasha Baker. She is coming to us out of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Attorney Baker, I always get in trouble when I share your current portfolio, so I'm going to leave that to you. Good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Greene. I am an assistant United States attorney in the U.S. Virgin Islands. I work as a prosecutor for the federal government, and I'm delighted to be here once again with you guys to discuss a very important topic.
All right, so we want to have a word of prayer before we go any further. Eternal Father and our God, thank you for the opportunity to share this afternoon and Let's Talk. We pray for your blessings and your guidance to be with all of our viewers, those who are listening via Second Advent Radio, and whether they are listening 101.5 FM or through any of its streaming platforms, those who are on SLC Adventist and those who are on SLC Church Channel, we pray that you will give a blessing to all who listen today. Grant us your peace and your grace in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, you know, last week we spoke about religious liberty, and we looked at religious liberty and public legislation. I am just doing a little check here to see where we are with our streaming platforms. But let's move on. Today we continue and we're talking about religious liberty and public legislation. Now, this is an important discussion. This is a very important discussion, and we want to encourage you to, Pastor James said earlier that you should call a friend and let them know that we are on. I would encourage you to do the same. Last week, we spoke about religious liberty being the freedom to believe and exercise or act upon religious conscience without unnecessary interference by government. Now, I know that when we talk about governmental interference, this is a very ticklish subject. Sometimes it may be that governments do not intend to interfere, but sometimes they do. I want to use the example. Pastor Adams, I'm directing this question to you. To begin with, I want to use the example of something I listened to back in, I believe it may have been around 2010. I remember back in 2010, Catholic adoption agencies were forced to close because they refused to allow same-sex couples to adopt children. So here you had a Christian orphanage with the matter of allowing people to come in and adopt children. The idea is there was I suppose you may say, in terms of fairness, you don't want to discriminate, that may be the better term. And the agencies were told, if you are going to offer a service, you have to offer this service to one and all, including gay couples who want to adopt children. And they chose to close. My question to you, Pastor Adams, this afternoon, to start the ball rolling, should a Christian orphanage allow homosexual couples to adopt its children?
Well, I pondered on that question a little and looked at it. Religious freedom is not just for the individual member, but for the institution as well. And while people have their rights and we have to respect that, you cannot weaken the civil right of one section of the society in order, in order to strengthen the rights of another. So just as how we can fight for the religious rights and freedom of our individuals, we must also be willing to fight for the religious rights of our institution as well, because our institutions are governed by the same religious values and our religious beliefs that we hold and expose there to us. And therefore we have a right in law, if I look at it closely, and maybe our legal person here can say that organizations have a basis in law as well. So it's not just the individual rights, freedom of rights and conscience, but also institutions. And we have institutions that are run and governed by the church, financed by the church. It's not a case where this is a state-aided or run institution. If an institution is governed totally by our principles, financed by our institution, everything like that, then I believe that in terms of we have a right. We have a right to decide what we will do in those regards. So it is not just for the individual, but also for institutions. And therefore, relating back to what we were saying last week, if we take the position that we don't care about other faiths and denominations and so, then people will not come to our aid or support on these matters, even if legislation is passed and so contrary to our rights and practice, what we hold dear and espouse as our religious belief. Everything that so that would be my take on that one.
Okay, so Pastor Adams, are you saying I'm trying to listen to you carefully, but I'm not sure I got an answer from you. I'm not sure if you're saying yes, there's religious liberty, but the question really was, if I am operating an institution, an adopting agency, do I have the right to limit who gets the service that I offer?
Yes, exactly. That's what I was saying. That and I was saying that the institution, we not only have individual rights to protect, but we also have institutional rights. The institution is run by us, and that those institutions also espouse our values and our religious belief. They function with those principles in mind. So we do have a right to choose in that regard. That question one is linked to another question, question four,
Well,
which I would say something else. No, question two. Question one
uh,
is linked to
let,
question two in some
let,
regard.
let me interrupt you a little bit, Pastor. I remember some years ago, and I don't know if Attorney Baker would remember this, because we had a discussion where there was a situation where a couple was being sued for refusing to sell a cake to a homosexual couple who wanted to get married.
Yes, I know the case.
Yes, and let me be careful how I say this. My perspective on it was, of course, we do not support homosexual marriages, but if I am selling cake, I don't know that I have the right to say you can't buy a cake because of your orientation or because of your belief. I am offering a service to the public. And if you come into my business establishment and say, I want this cake, I don't have the right to say, okay, because you are a same-sex couple, I'm not selling you the cake. So it's an interesting, now if you tell me, listen, I want you to make a cake for this occasion, because I'm getting married and this is what I want in it. It's an interesting discussion to have. But if I'm offering a service to the public, do I say I'm only offering the service to individuals who believe the same thing that I believe in? Would the government give me the license to offer service only to a sector of the society? I think that's the challenge here.
I remember that case. This was a case involving, you're talking about a case involving the baker.
Yes, correct.
Yes.
Right. That case is still sort of ongoing. I think this year, one of the courts actually ruled in favor of the baker, saying that the baker's decision to refer the couple to a different bakery was not unconstitutional, for lack of a better word, at this point. And it's one of several cases that courts have been grappling with. There was also a case involving a photographer who refused to perform his services for a same-sex wedding ceremony. And when I think about the issue personally, this is not regarding what the
principles in mind
ultimately decided, but when I think about it personally, it's really what is a service that you're rendering? So you can have a bakery and you can have several things or several cakes on display in your bakery, and perhaps a same-sex couple comes into your bakery and purchases a cake, which I think is a different scenario to saying, you come into the bakery and you say, I am getting married and I need you to prepare a cake for me for this wedding. And perhaps as part of you doing that, there are things that you have to put in a cake that resemble, the same-sex union. And that may be going a little too far. And so I do think that if a particular vendor is uncomfortable with the level that they have to go to render their service, then the court then has to look at how much of an infringement on their religious right would they have to do to engage in this act. And the same for the photographer. Photography is not just, something that's hands off. You have to be there, you have to be present, you have to engage the couple in different poses. And for someone who is, have strong religious beliefs about this union, there's definitely an intrusion on their rights for them to have to be this ingrained in the process. And then even apart from that, it is, if I own a business, why can't I, even if we weren't talking about same sex, why can't I choose what jobs I take versus those that I don't take, regardless of if we're dealing with same sex or not? How far is government gonna go to force me to engage in activities that I really have no interest in, you know? And so I think those are some of the issues that courts are now grappling with. And, you know, it's a fight. It's a fight because there are strong heads on both sides.
So this is my question.
Well, yeah, I was going to say this. All right.
There are times, Pastor Adams and Attorney Baker, when I go into a business, I must bear in mind that if I want to be true to my religious teachings, I may get some opposition. I just wanted to highlight that fact, that things are no longer as straightforward as they once used to be. It may be that somebody's going to ask me to do something that I'm uncomfortable with, and I may say, listen, I can't perform that service. And the individual may say, well, this is a free country. You can't deny me that right. That is discrimination. And I may end up being sued. So when we talk about religious liberty, I think the important thing for us to understand and appreciate here is that there are going to be individuals who are willing to challenge our perspective and charge us with discrimination.
Right. And I wanted to also state to your first point, Dr. Greene, when you spoke about institutions, you know, when it comes to, for example, institutions that are heavily funded by government, whether it's through grants, scholarships, or perhaps it's just one program, you know, there have been court decisions that, you know, have said that this government or this institution is so significantly funded or entangled with government that they should be seen as some sort of public actor and therefore cannot maintain the religious grounds that they do in terms of how they treat persons that come into their doors. And so there are some caveats when we talk about institutions being able to not allow, for example, as the example you gave, adoption. You know, if you are heavily funded by the government, or you take government grants, or you serve the public in some other way, a court can definitely say, look, you are offering a public service. You're now no longer just a religious institution, and therefore you should be held to the state standards regarding same-sex couples.
So let me therefore ask this question: where do we draw the line between religious rights and public service? Is it that once I'm offering a public service that I can have no restriction on who I serve?
Well, no, definitely. The church, you see, again, right, public service in the form of showing care and compassion, protecting people from abuse or discrimination, helping in time of distress, disaster. And so we understand that public service. But yes, as an institution, as a denominational institution, yeah, and I just want to introduce another scenario here, because I represent ADRA, Seventh Adventist here on the island. Just 2 months ago, we were called to training. They have asked me to be trained as a shelter manager. Now, if God forbid that we have a disaster or something here on the island, and I am the shelter manager, and my church is a shelter, do I say that I'm not offering this shelter service to you or homosexual couple? No, that's different. But I would not counsel and perform the marriage of a gay couple because against my religious belief and my personal conscience, even though the civil law, well, I'm running ahead of myself based on one another question that we another talking point that we have to address. And so the same thing, that the connection is there. If they, as the attorney said, you have a private institution not run by the government, not aided or funded by the government, this is basically a religious institution that hold dear our values, our religious beliefs, and so then I believe that as the how we would offer the service. There are legalities that are involved in the adoption of a child, there are several questions that has to be asked and so concerning what is our beliefs. There's a literature that explains the sociology of a child who belong to lesbian couple. There are arguments from both sides of the fence. Some sociologists believe that does not affect the child in any way. Others says yes, it does. And so we have to understand as the society and times changes, these complexities we will have to deal with, and we just have to answer and come up with an answer that kind of present fairness to all sides. So it is fairness to me, not to allow any government or civil law to dictate how my institution run or function once it is Christian and religious and is based on my religious belief and values.
Right. And I think the question speaks to, mostly when I'm involved in public service, because really this is the area where the true battle, plays out itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Pastor Adams hinted as to one of the characteristics of the balancing act that you have to undergo. And that is, are we catering to the individual or are we catering to the behavior? And I think that's where our religious stance comes into play. And so if we're using the example of a same-sex couple, and the example is performing a marriage, then you as the religious person who is against or do not believe in that same-sex union, having to perform that marriage, the government is perhaps, or the court or whoever has to analyze the issue is going to look at it as, okay, how much of an infringement on their religious right is it going to be for them to perform this ceremony? Versus if you have someone who comes to the police and say, look, I've been abused by my same-sex partner. As a police officer, are you going to say, oh, I'm not going to take your case because you are, this is a homosexual relationship? So in the two examples that I gave, you are dealing with a public service, which is really the area that we have a lot of the issues, but you're dealing with two aspects. One is really directly to the behavior, and two is to the person. In the second scenario, a person is reaching out to law enforcement for help because they've been abused. In the first scenario, two persons are coming together to say, I want you to perform this union that you as a Christian person is opposed to based on your religious belief. And as a public servant, now the state has an interest in performing all tasks or duties that the state, deems to be legal. And as part of an employee of the state, the government expects you to act accordingly. But you have your own religious beliefs and you're accountable to God first and the state second. So there may be occasions where you have to make a decision as to how you're going to proceed, you and your religious rights versus what the state is requiring, because both sides have a integral interest in how, the procedure or the process moves forward. But I think as individuals, as Christians, as religious believers, we have to really analyze, what is it that we're standing up against? Is it the behavior or the person? And I think when we analyze it that way, it's easier for us to make decisions when we're placed in these situations.
I appreciate so much that comment, and there is a temptation for me to expand on it, but our time is short, so I want to move on because there are some aspects that I really do want for us to cover. So let me ask now, because I want to get further into this matter of public legislations. Governments have a responsibility to protect its citizens. Laws and regulations are also necessary to maintain peace and stability. I think all of us would agree with that. Mm-hmm. It is sometimes said that there can be no freedom without restrictions. There are therefore necessary restrictions and impositions. We have things like speed limits, traffic laws, mandatory education for children. These, to some extent, you may want to say these are public legislations. These are laws that are implemented, and any government would tell you these are for the protection and safety and long-term good of its citizens. What determines if or when a government is overreaching its boundaries and interfering with one's freedom of conscience? Because we talked about the constitutional provision of freedom of conscience, but I in this debate, some would say, okay, on this particular occasion, the government has overreached. What determines whether or not a government has overreached its boundaries and interferes in so doing with one's freedom of conscience?
In the United States, and I think a lot of countries who generally follow and adopt the laws of the United States follow the same method in their analysis. The first part of this is to determine what is the actual infringement on this person's religious right or freedom or practice. So if we go back to the example I used before, if we use example of performing a same-sex marriage versus addressing a person who's homosexual in an abuse situation, the court are going to look at a specific scenario and determine what is the actual infringement. And once they make that determination, then they're going to look to the government intrusion on that infringement. And in the US context, when the court analyzes these issues, they have what we call like a standard of review. And if they find that there's a significant infringement, then the next step of their analysis is going to be, well, does the government have a compelling interest in prohibiting this behavior? And that compelling interest standard of scrutiny is very, very high. So in other words, unless the government can promote some overarching reason why it is the best thing for the government or for the community in a whole to prevent this behavior, then the court is going to determine, look, this person can continue to act or believe or worship, whatever the scenario is, in the manner in which they choose, because we do not see a compelling government interest to prevent this person from acting this way. And one of the examples, again, in the US context that we have of that is the landmark case of, what's it called? It's Sherbert versus Werner, which actually dealt with a Seventh-day Adventist who wanted the ability to work on Saturday. And when they were fired from their job because they didn't come in on a Saturday, they applied for unemployment benefits and were denied. And ultimately, the court ruled in favor of the Adventists and said that the government could not provide a compelling interest as to why this person should have been denied these employment benefits. There were cases after that that sort of lowered the standard a little bit, but then Congress now stepped in and implemented the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which sort of re-implemented that compelling interest standard. And so as it stands right now, the government must have a really good reason to infringe on a person's religious liberty right. However, I believe in the media and certain things that have been happening recently, I think we can see a slight watering down of that government intrusion, and there are many justifications these days for intruding on that, that religious freedom. But at least in the United States, I do still think that the religious freedom right is still one of the top political rights or liberties out there that is heavily litigated, and people are fighting to maintain some of those rights. But because the community and a whole society is moving so far away from religion, it's becoming increasingly difficult for those who still hold strong to certain beliefs to be able to maintain their stance on those belief systems.
Very, very interesting. This next question that I'm going to ask is perhaps just try to be a little more specific here. And I think Pastor Adams would understand my point very clearly. Under the Constitution, I have the right to certain freedoms. One such freedom is to be able to practice and teach my religion.
Yes.
In many of the Eastern Caribbean territories, a part of the Christian religion is marriage and the conducting of weddings by religious leaders. I'm not sure what the standard is in the US territories, but in the Eastern Caribbean territories, religious leaders, in many of them, most of them, religious leaders are marriage officers. Marriage is also a function of the state. In fact, while the church authorizes me to conduct weddings or marriages, it is the state that appoints me as a marriage officer. I do have to apply to be appointed a marriage officer when I move from one territory to another, for example. Now, when I do weddings, I therefore carry out a religious function and a civil function. For the time being, at least in my territory, marriage is defined as a union between a man and a woman. However, we are living in a climate where marriage is being redefined and gender is no longer straightforward. We talk about gender fluidity these days. Should the state which appoints me as a marriage officer redefine marriage? I'm asking, if the state which appointed me as a marriage officer redefines marriage to include same sex and determine that all marriage officers are to comply, how must the church relate to such? Because then I am a marriage officer appointed by the state. And if the state says, listen, you can't deny the person. Let's hear your take on this one.
Well, yeah, you did say a mouthful there, meaning that the state will have to redefine, because not just the Eastern Caribbean, I think all the Caribbean territory and the lawyer on here can say that we are influenced quite a lot by British law. And I remember when I was doing a little bit of family law and public policy, the definition by Lord Penzance is that I perceive marriage to be a voluntary union. I perceive marriage to be a voluntary union for life between two persons, man and a woman, who is respectfully male and female. You rightly said, because society is becoming more and more fluid, and all of these things are changing now because of what is happening. We have the gay movement, we have the LGBTQ, all of these movement, and everybody's clamoring for their rights and all of that, right? But you know, when we look at the definition for marriage, is it a sociological definition or is it a legal definition? Or when they change the legal definitions on the law book so they can be there, we have to contend with that. And as you ask the question, even our schools and institutions, our universities, the places of learning, what is written in the text in terms of the definition for family, the sociological definition, as opposed to the legal definition, right? So if they pass laws and legislation to change the legal definition of marriage, the same state that has licensed me, right, the church has ordained me, and I have the right to perform marriage and marriage ceremonies and these things, but it is the states who give me the license, and that is so. So I have to conform to I have to perform these marriages to satisfy both the state requirement and also my religious beliefs and values. So even though you give me the license as a state, I still have the choice. As a minister, I still have the choice, and I have to perform a marriage that is based on my religious belief and my own moral conscience. I obey the state as far as the law does not contradict with my religious beliefs and values. That's the point to which I obey the state. And so if that becomes the issue, then we'll have to have another conversation. And there is where we will have to, I think I was reading the literature that we have as a denomination as to what that is when we'll have to raise our voices. That is when we'll have to raise our voices, not just vocally, but also by pen, and to relate to the powers that be, an institution that be, that would make this legislation that would infringe on our right and our consciences in this regard. So not because the state changes its position that I have to automatically change my position. I still hold dear to my religious, I still have a right to hold dear to my religious belief and my religious values. And I have to perform a marriage or any ceremony of that sort, not going against the dictate of my conscience and what my religion, my religious beliefs stand for.
Well, you and I, Pastor Adams, should I say privileged, because, at least we are ministers of the gospel. We belong to an organization that has certain principles. But you can be a Seventh Adventist and not employed by the church. And you could be a Seventh Adventist who is a judge. And then your state says, you are a judge, you're required to do these ceremonies. Is it the same force now? Do I now say, hey, I can't now say, okay, I also serve my church, so I can't perform this, but now you're not serving the church because it is the state that is employing you. And someone asked a question earlier, which says, wouldn't such refusal be a violation of the terms of reference of the license issued by the government? When you're appointed, I want to think that when you're appointed that you would have signed off to certain things. I am willing to perform my duty, ABC. So if you're not working for the church, but you're working for the state, you are a justice of the peace. And the law is now that you perform same-sex weddings, you belong to
the same principle holds in relation to my religious beliefs and my conscience, right? Whether I be a JP, a judge, or a registrar, because people go there, they don't want it necessarily as a church ceremony, because marriage has to do with the legality. That part, we have a ceremony, that's the spiritual ceremony. The legality, we have to sign the documents, and then marriage is consummated. And there are issues with marriage and family law if the marriage is not consummated. That's a different discussion. But we have to understand that if I am a Seventh Adventist as a judge or a public figure that has to do with these things, that does not divorce my religious beliefs and my conscience from the whole issue, right? You see.
Well, I hear you, Pastor. I'm just not sure it is that straightforward. Of course, at the end of the day, I want to think that you have the right to say, I can no longer function in this capacity. I don't know how well, depending on the jurisdiction, one state may decide, okay, I'm going to excuse you and allow somebody else to do it. Or another state may say, you either do it or you quit the job. And at the end of the day, we have the choice. But I'm not so sure it's going to be straight across the board for everybody.
No, I definitely think, Dr. Greene, it's a difficult balancing act. However, I do think it could be argued under the specific circumstances of the situation we're dealing with. Because oftentimes courts look to, well, is there a way for the state to still uphold its duties and responsibilities simultaneous with the person exhibiting their religious right? And I know Dr. Greene, you spoke specifically about the aspect of being a judge. But if we analyze that alongside even a situation where you have a business that has, say, 2 employees, and one employee cannot work on Saturdays, the court can look at that and say, well, if you only have 2 employees, if your other employee calls out sick, you're really in a bind. So we do think it would be extremely difficult for you to have an employee on your books that always will have Saturdays off. And the court may look at that, okay, that might be burdensome. However, if you have an organization that has 50 employees and one of them is Adventist, the court could look at that and say, well, you can make a reasonable accommodation for this person because you have 50 other employees who do not who are not asking for the same accommodation. So in a state context, you know, is it where, you know, while this is a duty that should be performed, and perhaps the person who's taking a job, you know, is affirming that they will uphold whatever duties they need to, when it comes to a specific religious practice or belief, can the state still execute its duties or responsibilities irrespective of this person's religious belief or practice? And, you know, at the end of the day, if the analysis is difficult and or impossible, you know, it may just be up to the person to decide, look, maybe this is not a job I could take or maintain because, you know, it's going to at some point infringe on my religious belief. Now, hopefully it does not come to that, or an argument could be made that we can avoid getting to that place, because you want people to be able to work in the areas that they so choose without feeling that they're prohibited based on their religious belief. But there may be some scenarios where you have to decide, look, this is, you know, I value my belief system more, and I just cannot take this particular position.
Very interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're gonna get to that point at some time. The way things are going and how these legislations are being passed right now. In fact, there is one now, and the United States seem to be the pace setter with this, where they're talking about the fairness of justice, the equality and fairness. Is there equality and fairness when they are dealing with these legislations? And there's where religious liberty department and so will have to have a voice and to join in the conversation, and that has to be ongoing, because we're going to come to this situation and it's going to become more and more difficult for us, for people, and for some of our membership members who work in these legal institutions, be it with the state or whatever, and
Okay, it
these
appears.
personal conscience. It will have to be the individual call. I don't think that we are there as yet, but I see that time coming. That time is coming, and coming very quickly.
So we do understand, and you know, as a people who understand our prophetic heritage,
yes,
we do understand that it will not always be easy sailing for us going forward.
No.
Now I want to get to something else. I want to get to something else here. We kind of pressed for time here, but we talk about the separation of church and state, right? If I have a religious institution, let's say a school, is it discrimination to accept or to give preference to? I'm a Seventh Adventist and I have a school. Is it discrimination to accept or to give preference to Seventh Adventist students over others? And is it discrimination to determine that our students should maintain a certain standard of justice? So there are really two questions in one. I mean, the school is serving the society, you may say. So if I have an admittance policy that says I give preference to Seventh Adventist students, would that be seen as discrimination? It's a Seventh Adventist school. Would that be seen as discrimination?
Well,
okay, so both of you are starting at the same time, and both of you are waiting on each other.
I mean, your word preferences have been broad. You know, in preference in what way? In terms of admission to the school?
Yes. So,
okay, so no.
You know, we like to say, for example, that Adventist schools are designed for Adventist children. They're designed, let me make sure I explain that, so that we can provide opportunity for Adventist children to get an Adventist education. So if on the application, in the application process, I have 300 students, I can only accept 250 based on my space provisions. And I have 300, I have 50 students who are not Seventh-day Adventists. Can I make a case for accepting the Adventists over the non-Adventists based on the fact that they are Adventists and this is an Adventist school?
Yeah,
sorry.
again, go ahead. Again, it's an institution operated by, run by the denomination, right? And if people come to our institution, they are also agreeing by our code of ethics and behavior, what is written there. Yeah, when I was going to the Christian college, the making of a Christian college, those people who put it together, there were some things in the student handbook. So if you were coming there and not as an Adventist, you had to agree that you will abide by those things that are there written in the student handbook. So in the case where you have a stool and just limited space, with their philosophy for education and all of that, you have a limited space. So the limited space obviously will be given to the membership of the church, right? Even though our provision in education makes room for others who are not Adventists, and we have a percentage, I think it is 25% of our student population in our institution, and that is why we have that set up for the mere function of using that as our missionary opportunity to influence that that 25% in the ways, in spiritual and godly ways, as in my institution. I remember there were guys who came there to the Darrow CUC, and they were influenced by the whole atmosphere and the Christian philosophy and lifestyle and all of that. They came there not being Adventists, but became Adventists. So our institution allow for that kind of a thing where you can influence people in those regards. But you're making out a case that there's limitation in terms of space. Who do we give preference to? I don't think that is going to be seen as though any discrimination if you give preference, first of all, to those who primarily institution was set up to benefit and target.
And the caveat I was going to give is really, it depends on the country that you're in, because each country is governed by different laws. In the US, and I think almost all of the countries in the North Caribbean Conference and South Leeward Conference, you're able to do that. I think St. Kitts has one of the most specific, and it may be the same language in other constitutions as well, but in their conscience section, they specifically say that every religious community shall be entitled at its own expense to establish and maintain places of education and to manage any place of education that it wholly maintains, and such a community shall be prevented from providing religious instruction for persons, shall not be prevented, from providing religious instruction for persons of that community in the course of any education that it wholly maintains. So the term that community, sort of suggests the Adventist community or whatever religion we're referencing. But I want to go back to my caveat. For example, in the North Caribbean Conference, we do have an Adventist school, I believe it's in St. Martin, that is significantly funded by the government. And I think in that scenario, there is some restriction on the school being able to deny students that are not Seventh-day Adventists from coming into its walls, because the government so heavily funds the school so that the school can accept students who are non-Adventists. So in other words, you can't say across the board, yes, there's some caveats to it. One of the biggest caveats, like I often say, is depending on how much, because you could have a religious institution, but it's so heavily funded by the government that you cannot maintain the same religious freedoms that you would ordinarily maintain if you are solely funded. Like even in the section that I just highlighted from St. Kitts institution, it specifically says, every religious community shall be entitled at its own expense. So that's saying that the government is not funding it.
So it's interesting. Perhaps a topic for future Let's Talk discussion is whether or not we should accept government funding for our schools. I know that's a big debate, and it's an interesting road to go down, but we only have 8 minutes, and I do want to get to something else. To what extent then should a Christian, so I'm funding my own school, to what extent should the government determine my standards? Does the government have the right to say, when they're not funding my institution, that, you know, I have to operate by this standard or that standard, as the case may be, apart from, you know, ensuring that there is a certain level in terms of curriculum?
Well, yeah, going back to, was it question 4, the same question, because I'm saying that the institution also has its rights as a Christian institution, just like the individual will have rights. So as we just had, and noticed what the attorney did quote, and I was alluding to that in answering the question from the front, from the beginning, that it's an institution that is run by the church, funded by the church. If it is funded by government, that's a different story. But once our institution is funded by the organization itself, and then we have the sole right to choose who our employees are, who our staff and faculty will be, and all those things, because it's an institution that is run, funded, everything by the church, and we have our values, or have a religious system of beliefs, we have our values, all that goes. So the government cannot arbitrarily dictate for us in how we should offer, you know, our programs and what we will do in terms of practicing our beliefs.
So someone is asking, one of our viewers, to what extent does God acknowledge human rights? So, that's an interesting question.
Well, from time immemorial, because human rights began way there in heaven, and not with our first parents from Eden, we should say that. God is never arbitrary, and I think that is how we started last week in our conversation. God is never arbitrary. He gives us the freedom of choice. That is our human right as well. And from the beginning, from Eden, our first parents had the right, the human right to exercise, whether to obey God or not, or to his laws or not. They chose otherwise. God still respects our choice, and say he doesn't ever force himself upon us. You know, let us reason. Come, let us reason. I stand at the door and knock. If you want to open, I will come in. So God is not arbitrary. He is not coercive. That's not his style. That's the style of Lucifer, who became Satan, the adversary, right? So our human rights, yes, is God is not against our human rights. There are consequences, yes, to exercising that human right, and you know, even in that situation, God still gives us the freedom to choose.
Attorney Baker, we only have 5 minutes, so let me ask you this question. Government sometimes gives mandates. Well, let me say it this way: governments, because, you know, sometimes give mandates. Children have to be vaccinated in order to attend school. Persons have to be registered in order to vote. When does a mandate become a matter of religious liberty? You know, we just concluded, well, maybe I shouldn't even say just concluded. We are slowly working our way out of a pandemic. And of course, there was a big debate over whether or not the government should exercise its right to say that people must or must not be vaccinated. But my question is, again, when does a mandate become a matter of religious liberty?
I mean, you mentioned the pandemic, and it's very difficult to determine whether the whole vaccine situation was even religious in a sense, but it definitely touched on the liberty to just decide what you want to do with your own body. And so, you know, I don't want to focus too much even on the vaccine part of it, even though that definitely was a situation where it's like I'm being forced to do something that I don't want to do. And I know there are people, maybe for religious reasons, are opposed to vaccines. But essentially what a government is looking at, or what we're looking at is there a sincerely held religious belief at play? You know, is there some belief that this government intrusion is going to infringe on? You know, and I think that was the debate with the whole COVID vaccine. What is the religious right that we're looking at that the government is going to infringe on? And once we can identify that right, then we have to look at the interests of the government in trying to prohibit or enforce these types of restrictions or mandates.
So attorney, if I may just interrupt here again, and I'm, because neither do I want to get too bogged down on the vaccine issue. So I'm more general. When does a government mandate become a matter of religious liberty? It could be vaccine, it could be public education, it could be something else. But when do I consider it as a violation of my religious duty?
Right. When you recognize that it's infringing on some sincerely held religious belief that you have. So by way of example, if the government decides, look, you as Seventh Adventists could no longer worship on Saturdays. We are finding that Saturdays is going to be a work day and we don't want worship to happen then you have a problem. Or if you say, even personally, you can't educate your child in the Adventist faith, then we have a problem. I mean, those are extreme examples. But when you see that there's a sincerely held religious belief at play and the government is making a law or a mandate or restriction that prohibits you from acting or giving out pamphlets, whatever it is, then you're at issue. And I think that we have greater stance to uphold our belief system if we fight harder. I think sometimes we give up. We just take for granted that, okay, this is the government, we're powerless and we can't do anything. And a lot of times government act based on what the masses are fighting for.
Interesting. So, I remember, again, from my vantage point, that statement you made, if it's a sincerely held religious view, and I know that some people may have a position that their religion, and the interesting thing in the COVID, while I don't want to focus too much on this, but it's a good example. The interesting thing in the COVID dilemma, or vaccine dilemma, if I may say, was that there were individuals who claimed to have a religious perspective that was not necessarily the same as their religious organization stated. So what the government was asking for is, show me where in your religion articles, whatever denomination you belong to, it says that we have a problem with this. And that became quite an issue, because some persons may say it is my right to choose what I believe, but then you belong to a certain religion and the religion doesn't say that. And so that was the dilemma there.
Mm-hmm.
Our time is kind of up.
Yeah.
I am sorry that our time is up, because there are a few other issues I wanted to raise, but I want to thank you both for sharing with us this afternoon. I was looking at some comments, and the point is that, again, as a people who understand our prophetic heritage, the understanding that we have is that we have to bear in mind that we will have to make personal decisions when it comes to our relationship with God. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to determine whether we are comfortable doing something or not. We may have to walk away from a job. As a church, we may need to make petition or raise our voice against what we see as discrimination. But at the end of the day, we need to know that governments are not always going to walk the line of the Bible.
Definitely.
And as individuals, we have to make a choice. So thank you both very much for sharing. It was a pleasure having you. We are going to be continuing next week. We should have some other individuals with us. We're going to be talking more on religious liberty, but some other aspects. We want to invite you to join us, viewers, next week. It promises to be just as interesting. And may God bless you. Attorney Baker, Pastor Adams, it was a delight. It was a pleasure having you on. And we wish you God's blessings and God's peace.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good evening to our viewers and listeners, and do have a pleasant rest of the Sabbath and a pleasant new week.
And to all of our viewers and listeners, remember, we're back here next week at 3 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time.